Hey, welcome to today's webinar. This is Geoff Zoeckler. We're going to give folks another 3 or 4 minutes or so to log in, but just wanted to make sure I said something out loud if you're trying to test your speakers to see if they're working. And for those who are already in, you're obviously seeing the request for while we wait to write down 3 words that describe empathy. And if you're a Twitter user, go ahead and share that out in the Twitter sphere. You can @Kaleidoscope and also hashtag empathy in design. There's already a few responses out there, and so you can take a look at other people's comments as well, seeing some words like compassion, interaction, relationship. And those will continue to grow as more participants log in. And for those just logging in, we're going to give folks another couple of minutes before we get started, and you can just follow the prompt on the screen for now. And that request is to write down 3 words that describe empathy, and to go ahead and post to Twitter if that's something that you do. All right, so it's about 1 o'clock, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Hopefully you are in the right spot. We are going to be talking about advanced design thinking, and specifically how to start with empathy to deliver breakthrough innovation. I'm going to introduce myself a little bit more in just a moment, but if you're trying to follow me through Twitter in the future, I'm @Geoff Zoeckler. I work for Kaleidoscope, and their symbol is KA-scope. And also we're going to be using the hashtag empathy in design for any of your thoughts today. And for those who are just logging in, there was a request to write down 3 words that you associate with empathy. We're going to be looking at those and pulling those in throughout this talk. So a little bit more about myself. I have a background in chemical engineering. I went to Madison, Wisconsin. And I spent 7 years developing food products with General Mills and Birds Eye Foods. I followed that up and got a master's in creativity, and I've spent the last 5 years doing empathy-based innovation consulting with a lot of Fortune 50 companies, and including some startups as well. That has led into a lot more speaking, teaching, and also I'm now a contributing author in a couple of different spots. And one of the books that we're referencing today is Big Questions in Creativity for 2015. I have the first chapter in there, and it's all about how empathy relates to the creative problem-solving process and can be used for innovation. So if you're interested in that topic, that's going to be a book to reference. It goes into further detail than I'm able to go in the short amount of time for this webinar. One of the other key things about me as well is that I'm a father of 3 daughters. My oldest is 9, my middle child is 7, and my youngest is 5. And actually, I'm going to start with a personal story that involves my oldest daughter, a little bit of how I got into this topic of empathy and why I feel a lot of passion around it. So about a year ago, my oldest daughter was in 3rd grade, and she was preparing for her school musical. And she had spent several weeks getting ready for this, singing the songs around the house, picking out her clothes, and my wife and I thought it was really adorable. And as the day came, she got really nervous, but also with some anticipation and excitement as well. And we drove in to the musical. We sat down. We looked up, and watched her. And as the kids came out, it looked a little something like this. And I've got a video to show you more specifically what that looked like. And it's kind of difficult to send a video through webinar, so we're going to try doing it differently. I've actually included it as a handout, which is one of the options on the right side of the screen. If you click your little orange arrow, you can see a bar that says handouts, and you can download the first one, and it's a video. And otherwise, you can go directly to the link that is www.vimeo.com, and then the series of numbers there, which is 144523097. It's about 30 seconds long. I'm going to put up a poll, and so when you're done watching the video, I want you to complete the poll, and that's when I know that you have successfully found your way of how to do that. So I'll be back with you after you've watched that video. And I see many people have made their way into the poll. We'll just give a little bit more time to make sure everyone's got a chance. All right, with about 75% of folks going through it, I'm going to go ahead and close it out. It's not that big of a deal if you did or not. Mostly just wanted to test and make sure that things are working right. I'm going to go ahead and share those results just for fun as well. So 9% of folks saw boys and girls singing. 3% said there were some killer dance moves. 11% saw a boy on the right side of the screen struggling a little bit. And 77% said all of the above. I'm going to put that poll away and go back to my screen. And so my wife and I sitting in the screen saw some of the, sitting in the stand, saw some of the same things that you guys commented on as well. So we noticed that the girls and boys were having a great time. They were dancing, but also that there was this boy on the right side of the screen that was struggling. And my heart started to hurt for this boy. And came to find out, a little bit later that this boy has mental difficulties and actually had an aide, a professional aide, standing off the stage. Because when he goes into performances like this, it's usually not very long until he needs to come off of the stage. That he has difficulties handling it amongst his peers, and that level of anxiety gets to him. And I was feeling really negative for him. I was feeling bad and feeling like this must happen all the time amongst his peers. This must be something that happens in school settings, in social settings, and something he has to deal with a lot, that he feels completely isolated from his peers. And while I was feeling that, an action occurred up on stage that sent an emotional wave through the crowd and really changed the course of the event for that evening. And that was when my daughter Lily reached out and held his hand. It was one of those very simple things that you look at and think, wow, that was actually really easy. The moment she reached out and held his hand, his leg stopped stomping, his body calmed down, and he stayed for the entire hour performance on the stage that evening. And it was a very simple act, and every now and then my daughter would release his hand, and when he started to struggle again, she'd reach out and hold his hand. And it was that action that made me start questioning, well, I was sitting in the stands feeling bad for this kid, feeling negative about the things he must go through. The person standing right next to him, who is my own daughter, reached out to actually act to change his behavior and to show a sign of what I believe is real empathy. And that's led me into digging into this topic much further. And so some of the topics we're going to cover during this webinar is, what is empathy? Why do we do it? Why don't we always do it? What does it require of you in order to engage with this? And if you're using it for problem solving or for innovation, what's the return on that investment? And finally, we're going to end with some tips of how to implement within your organization. But first, I want to take a step back and just talk about where does empathy fit within this problem-solving process, within innovation. And one of the things that's most commonly referred to is design thinking when you're talking about empathy and innovation. And design thinking is centered around these 5 different areas. Sometimes it's organized into 3 camps, sometimes 5. But they really break down into these different pieces of empathizing, defining a challenge, ideating against that challenge, prototyping potential solutions, and then testing those prototypes to get feedback. And what's unique about this compared to any other innovation process are really these 2 principles, which are on the front end and on the back end. And that empathy step requires that you care deeply about the people you're designing for before you start. So you don't start with a technology in mind and try to figure out how do we get people to want this new technology. You don't even start with the problem in mind. You start with creating an empathic connection to the potential users and allow that to guide the rest of the process. And on the back end, you have to be willing to try out your ideas long before you think they're ready in order to get iterative feedback along the way. So that's really the 2 things that make design thinking different from just a traditional innovation process. We're going to focus most of the time on the first piece, which is empathy. So what is empathy? Through the various different Twitter comments, I saw some words like caring, reflective, thoughtful, to feel, to act, perspective taking, relationships, compassion. So a lot of different similar areas here that has to do with you feeling something for another individual who's feeling something. And as we look at some common definitions, one of them that is referred to very often is to walk in someone else's shoes. And I might also consider that perspective taking, so trying to imagine what it would be like to be standing in another situation. And actually, the dictionary has what I think is a great definition, the ability to understand and share the feelings of another. So this takes it to a slightly different direction than that common definition and actually talks about sharing the feelings of another. And I want to offer one more definition as well that I think can help to simplify it even further. So it's a 3-part process. The first one is allowing what's coming into your head to impact your heart, which stirs your gut to act on another's behalf. So when I was sitting in the stands and feeling what that boy might be feeling, I had made it through head. I had seen him struggling. I'd gotten to where it was impacting my heart, but I really didn't have a reaction to act on his behalf. where my daughter standing on stage made it through that third phase as well, and actually stirred something in her gut, and and then that required that she act. She couldn't not act once she made it that far. And empathy requires that. And so I think it's really important to think about this as a bit of an equation, that head plus heart response that you have to a situation equals some sort of gut reaction and action on your part, desire to act on another behalf. And some of you might be thinking, well, how does this relate to sympathy? Often the topic of sympathy and empathy are talked about somewhat synonymously. However, they're very different things. Brené Brown talks about sympathy as driving disconnection and empathy as driving connection. And another way of phrasing this very simply might be, it's sympathy when you have this internal thought of that sucks for you, or that sucks for them, like that's too bad. And it switches over into empathy when it's, well, this sucks for us. Because you've gone through an emotional process and engaged yourself to a level where you're now part of that issue that you've identified, whether that's positive or negative. So it could also be, well, that's great for you versus that's great for us. It's the act of involving yourself in the emotional state of another. There are a couple different types of empathy. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this during the webinar, but there's been shown to be contagious empathy and also cognitive empathy. Contagious is the stuff you're born with, and one of the simplest examples of this is looking at infants crying. So, in the hospital, when there's a series of infants together, when one starts crying, usually the rest will start crying, and that's just a form of contagious empathy. Versus cognitive empathy requires a decision to connect. It's a cognitive process. It's your choice whether you're going to do that or not. And as humans, we have both. We have both capabilities. And why? Why do we have that capability? There are various different perspectives. Marco Iacoboni talks about mirror neurons in our brains, and that we are actually born with this innate ability to experience the emotions of another as if we're experiencing it ourselves. That our brains pick up on other people's emotions, and then our brains start firing the same neurons as if we were experiencing that emotion. And what that's doing is preparing your body to get into that state to better connect with another person. And why we have that can, usually most things that we have can be linked back to some element of survival. So humans have never been the fastest and the strongest of the mammals on Earth. Lion can chase us down and eat us for dinner, but yet we have thrived as a society. And part of that is because we've been born with this innate caring for each other, that we care what happens, and that we form societies where we look after each other. And some of that is linked in Jeremy Rifkin's book on this idea of civilization and growth of civilization. That we start off with this idea of really caring about our bloodline, those who are born and part of our society. And as technology has changed in the way we interact as a culture, and we start to go to places like a common church, well, then you start to associate with that group. And as you start to create some nationality, well, now you start to associate with being like an American or being a South African. And as technology improves and we're able to communicate more effectively across the globe, his theory is that we're going to be moving closer and closer to a truly empathic civilization where we all care about each other because we are connected in some way through that desire to nurture and understand one another. So empathy has a lot of potential positives, but it also is a somewhat taxing process. And there are lots of reasons why we don't engage with empathy all the time. One of them is the amount of energy that it requires. So that process of using your head, allowing that to affect your heart, which creates an action within your gut, it's a lot of energy, and it takes a lot of effort. And it usually comes with an element of risk. So thinking to my daughter Lily, reaching out to act and hold his hand came with societal risks, came with risks that she perceived within herself. And so sometimes we're not able to cognitively get over that risk. It also usually has some element of sacrifice. So this might be thinking about the beggar on the street. And if you were truly empathizing with them, that might mean that you're going to end up sacrificing some of your financial resources, some of your time. Maybe you feel compelled to invite them into your home. And you may not be ready for that level of sacrifice. You may not want to choose to engage with that person in that time. And another one is about the external reward structures, or even the like quote-unquote game that is often put around how we spend our time at work. This is one that I think is most relevant within the corporate culture of, are we rewarded to create an empathic connection with our end user? Is it part of how we're analyzed at the end of the year on if we performed a good job or not? So we're going to move into the next video. And so again, I'm going to try to put the link down in the chat. It's also handout number 2. Otherwise, you can go to this link. And it's about a minute long. I'm going to put up a poll, and I know you're done when you've come back and you've answered that poll. So we're going to go ahead and have you watch the video, and then come on back when you're ready. All right, it looks like we've got the majority of folks who have finished the poll. So I'm going to close it in just a moment. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close it. I'm going to share the results as well. So about 10% of the folks online right now thought that the first video showed a lack of empathy. About 26% for the second. 54 said both, and about 10% said neither. And certainly this was not an open-ended question. It was a very leading question. And I don't necessarily believe one way or the other, but wanted to see where the response was. And this is going to allow us to talk a little bit more in depth about, well, what was happening in those videos. What did we see? So in the first video, we saw a baseball game occurring, and pitcher threw the ball, batter hit the ball. That ball flew straight at the pitcher's head, hit him in the head, he fell down. The runner ran to first base. The ball went over to third baseman, he threw it to first base, and the play was called out by the ump. And if I was to let that video go on further, you would see after that moment, people did come to the pitcher to check on his health. So it wasn't that they were completely ignoring him, but they were finishing the play. And there is something in that of what we might refer to as the game dynamic, which is a form of reward structure. So when you're in that moment and you're in a game, you know what the rules are. And the rules are to finish the play. that you've hit the ball is fair play, you need to run over that first base line. And for professional baseball players, they're paid a lot of money to follow those rules. So if the batter had not run and had instead gone out to help the pitcher, that might have been viewed as a negative thing from the perspective of how is he rewarded and what is his job in that moment. And somewhat of a similar thing occurred in the second video. So a news reporter is standing outside giving a broadcast about the prices of gas, when right behind her happens what I would refer to as a much more interesting news story. Two cars completely crash into each other at probably about 30 miles an hour. And you can see if you watch it again, she flinches just a little bit over her shoulder, but regains her posture and looks back at the camera. And it's not until the person in the home office is like saying, like, hey, what just happened there? And their banter back and forth might seem somewhat insensitive to that situation of, oh, I'm sure they're fine. And when you think about it, it's, well, should they have acted differently? Should they not have? That's up for debate, but certainly what was occurring was some element of, this is my job. My job is to report on this piece, and I need to do that despite whatever is going on around me. And so there wasn't a cognitive decision in that moment to say, I'm going to approach whatever's happening next with a sense of empathy. And so if there are someone that needs something around me, I'm going to change what I'm doing. And I'm not saying that that's what you should do as a news broadcaster, but these are certain elements where we can see there are structures put in place, there are things, guardrails of what is your job, when is it appropriate to leave script versus not. And that's all part of this decision of cognitive empathy. So I want to show empathy through 4 different examples. And we're going to start with one that's about the simplicity of connecting through a photo. So there was a doctor in Jerusalem who had a theory, and he tested his hypothesis. So he, as a general practitioner, was curious about what would happen if he sent a picture of his patients along with a radiology scan. So if he sent the CT scan to the radiologist, would it impact at all what they reported and what the findings were? So he took about 50 patients, he put 25 pictures with one scan and no pictures with the other, and he sent them out to be reviewed by professionals. And what he got back was very interesting. So 4 of the doctors who had received a photo of the patient, in their report back, they used about 30% more words. There was about a 40% increase in incidental findings. So those are findings that weren't part of what the doctor had thought the CT scan was for. And there was a 225% increase in personal recommendations. So what the radiologist was suggesting could be done to improve the situation. And that was through the simple power of just a photo. Now you can imagine, what if that radiologist had had a personal consultation, or what if a video had been included? The results might have been even different. And so if you're reviewing success based on how much effort did that radiologist put in to complete those findings, you could say that choosing a path of empathy, having that person attempt to connect with another human being through that visual, certainly improved the results and the outcome. A second example, looking beyond just what was said. So this is an example of a typical insight within the space of diabetes. So going out and doing research within this medical space, you often ask people, what are your problems? And you might hear things like this. I know I need to take my insulin before meals at night, but my life is hectic and night times are busy. I often forget it. And so you might hear that by multiple people, and you could conclude across a team that this is a solid insight. This is something that people need. And then when you're moving into that phase of ideation, what would you do for this person? Lots of different ideas can pop up, some of which often, when I ask this question to a live audience, often include things like apps and alarm systems, or once was your TV would actually be interrupted with a message on the bottom of the screen to remind you to take your medicine, which all of those would absolutely solve what had been heard. However, an important thing to know, work by Albert Morabian back in the 80s and has been validated for the last 30 years, 35 years or so, is that most emotional information is not contained in the words alone, that actually 93% of emotional information is contained within body language and tone of voice. And this is a reality that we all get. You know, you don't ask your wife, your fiance to marry you over the phone. You know, you show up live because that's how those emotions come through. And if you need to lay someone off, you don't do it through email. You know, you invite them into your office because it's a highly emotional situation. And so when you're looking at just the spoken word, which can happen a lot through traditional research approaches, you end up with typical innovation. That's what everyone is saying and hearing, but you're actually leaving 93% of the emotional context on the floor. You're leaving it behind. And so when you engage at an empathic level and attempt to create insights from that other 93%, you know, what can happen? Well, in this instance of the diabetes example, it might look something like this. So instead of the person saying this is what the team thought was actually being communicated through body language and tone of voice. So taking my insulin is a reminder that I am broken. I don't mind giving it to myself in the morning when I'm alone, but at night times and my family is close by, it feels like a reminder to them that I am broken. And so one of the questions here that I think is very powerful, not just what would you do for them, you can create lots of ideas off of this type of insight as well, but what would you never do for this person? And in this case, it would invalidate potentially a lot of the things you came up with from the first insight. Despite it being the same group of people that you're trying to solve problems for, if you look at just the words and what they're saying, you might end up on a very different path that actually is causing emotional damage to your end user. And you can find examples of this in the marketplace right now. And I'm not picking on this particular product, but it is a type of thing that might come out as an innovation based on what people are saying, which is, oh, I often forget, and I could use reminders. Well, this is a system that actually alerts your family to help you stay on top of your medication needs. And depending on what your disease state is, that might feel really emotionally inappropriate. So it's important to go and get that context first of, is this something that emotionally is going to resonate with people? And you may not know until you've invested millions of dollars into your execution and launch of the product. Other types of devices could be looking at that second insight of people want to have some sort of more automated system where people don't even know that they have diabetes. So this is an example of an innovation that takes that twice daily routine and changes it to once or twice a year through an implant. Now, this may not be a solution for everyone, but I would guess that this does more adequately address the emotional needs if that second insight, that empathic insight, is accurate. And the impact there can be time and money savings. If you were to go down a path that actually doesn't resonate with consumers, you might never know what the reason was that app failed or that link to the TV didn't work out, because you had an initial insight that validated it, but now it felt like people weren't buying it. When you use an empathic approach, you usually end with longer lasting innovations. Things that resonate with people emotionally last longer in the marketplace. And ultimately, too, you'll feel better about your jobs because you're creating positive emotional impact on those people, and the stories will come in and keep you motivated for years to come. So just doing a quick time check, I'm going to share this third example as well. This is about working to create brand advocacy and how empathy might be able to play a role in that. So first, just looking at some findings from the Boston Consulting Group, they have a measurement to determine brand advocacy of different companies across different sectors. And they've published this information in the past, which is that companies across the board who measure high with brand advocacy perform, from a growth perspective, significantly better than those who have low brand advocacy. So that number in the circle, that's a percentage of growth for those companies that have high level of brand advocacy. And what I mean by advocacy is, it's providing a sense of quality for the company's operations and offerings. It helps companies cut through clutter that's saturated with media messages, and it's important when in the average Western consumer is bombarded with up to 3,000 brand impressions in a typical day. So brand advocacy means that not only did you see that, but you took a step to share that with another person. So you saw one of those 3,000 brand impressions and became an advocate and shared that with another colleague or family member. So there's another video example here. This should be the third one. I'm going to post the link as well into the chat, or you can type in directly into your web browser. And like the other ones, I'm going to put up a short poll, so I'll know that after you have downloaded this or gone to the site and watched it when we're ready to move on. It looks like the majority of folks have started getting into the poll. I'll leave it open for just another 10 seconds or so. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close it, and I'm going to post the results. Okay, so about 5% of the audience thought that the first video was more likely to create brand advocates, and 85% thought the second, and about 10% thought equal. And nobody chose neither, which meant that both ads were probably viewed as somewhat compelling and might create action. So the majority of folks thought that probably that second ad was more likely to create brand advocates. And certainly we could have a discussion of what type of consumer are they targeting, what type of action are they requiring. But if I was to say, which of these two ads do you believe chose to use empathy as part of their marketing innovation? Probably see similar poll results of the majority of folks saying that it appeared Guinness was using an empathic approach, was attempting to create an emotional experience with the viewer and thereby compelling them to act on the behalf of that brand. So when thinking about innovation, this is a great example for marketing innovation of how empathy can play a role. That when you truly understand the needs of another, that might be able to be communicated through in marketing materials. And I'm going to share one fourth and final example, and this kind of walks through the entire design thinking process, starting with empathy. The business objective for this work was simply to increase the sales of feminine care products. And the question that went into this was, how could we create a deeper impact on the lives of the women that we serve? Not just how can we increase sales, but actually how could we create a deeper impact on the lives of women? So the approach that was suggested was, well, you should probably engage in design thinking. You should start with empathy. And it actually involved, too, going across the globe to 5 different international sites to learning about women on different continents. And so that empathy step looked like some training, actually spending a half a day to a full day in workshops practicing the technique of communicating emotions with others, identifying emotions, looking for that 93% of information that comes in body language and tone of voice, and then took that out into some interviews with women, one-on-one in homes, a little bit different than might traditionally be done, where 3 or 4 hours were spent with one individual. And sometimes you go into things like focus groups with 8 people, and it's more difficult to create an empathic connection in that situation. And then the team took all of the findings back to define what are some potential insights, what are the things that we felt, that we saw, how can we group and organize those, and what types of ideas does that compel? What is my gut response? What do I want to do for these women that we've now created an empathic connection to? This process was part of a larger initiative. So this team was also doing quantitative work as well. And some of the things that correlated with what was found qualitatively through those empathic interviews and what was found in the polls was that the team identified that girls experience a significant drop in self-confidence when they hit puberty. Now that's not necessarily something brand new, but through an empathic lens, the vice president of Global Always was quoted as saying that the deep consumer insight and that understanding really made them step back and think. And I witnessed that it was more than just think. It was this desire to act, that that team was on fire, needed to do something about what they had identified. It wasn't just an intellectual process. And so where that ended was in something that many of the audience might be familiar with, was a campaign that they were testing called #LikeAGirl. And it was an experiment. They produced a video and they put the video on YouTube to see what would happen. So this is moving into the prototype testing phase. It skipped a lot of the traditional process of going out and testing and seeing how does this ad resonate with these different demographics. It just was put on YouTube to see how many viewers. And the previous YouTube video that had been put up by the brand Always had about 30,000 views, and it had been posted for about a year and a half. Well, in the first 3 months of this video being posted, which I'm not going to share the video now, but if you want to watch it afterwards, you can search YouTube or just the internet for Always #LikeAGirl. The impact of that was pretty significant, and trying to look at it in a financial perspective, traditional advertising would say that it costs about 1 cent to 5 cents per impression on TV. And research has shown that when you voluntarily click something, that's worth about 10 times the amount of involuntarily watching. Within 3 months, there were over 50 million views of this video. And so that equated to about $5 to $25 million worth of brand awareness for their company. They also went on to create a version of this that they had played during the Super Bowl. It was the #1 consumer ad for recall based on it. If those of you remember, it was the video played directly after the halftime show, which is when most viewers were watching. So through this experiment, they chose to invest heavily into this idea, and it is starting to show significant rewards. So we're going to move on to what it requires. This topic of empathy is big, so how do you do it? How do you implement it within your organization? Well, when you're talking with another person, the very first and most important step is that you decide to connect with them and invest all of your senses, that you are observing and attempting to get all 100% of that emotional information. The second step, once you've made that decision, is to identify those emotions, specifically looking at nonverbals. And we all have a common set of emotions that we've experienced by the age of 25. And so while it might not be the exact situation that they're describing, you can spot the emotion, and you yourself can then do the third step, which is recall a time you've experienced a similar set of emotions. So if you're communicating grief, I can think of a time that I also experienced grief. And what that does is it sets my entire body chemistry to be more like yours. And as I start to consider what you might need in that moment, if my body chemistry is closer to yours, I'm likely to be more accurate in my response to trying to help or be part of that emotional situation. And this isn't just negative, this is also positive as well. If you come to me with great signs of happiness, if I can identify that that's a sign of happiness, I can recall a time that I was also happy, I'll be in a better chemically emotional state to do something with you that shows I'm connected and we are both happy. Whereas if I choose not to connect and decide not to, I might showcase a very different emotion and that conversation doesn't go as deep. So if you're happy but I am feeling anxiety, the conversation stops pretty quick and doesn't go deeper. The final piece when you're engaged in this way too is, check your gut. Check what your reaction is, how you might want to act in their behalf. Share what you think, like, hey, here's what I hear you saying, and here's how I think I might be able to help, or what I think could be next, and see if that it resonates with them. And this process actually occurs very rapidly, but we're breaking it down to see how would you practice it if you wanted to engage further with cognitive empathy. So I wanted to share a way to use this within your team environments. So you can do a screenshot of this. Otherwise, I'll also be sending out a shortened version of this deck, including this, following the webinar. But this is an activity you can guide anytime you've got a group of people in a meeting setting. It takes about 20 to 30 minutes to give enough time to be respectful of what can occur. But this is setting people into partners, asking one person to share with the other a significant personal story that contains emotion. And while they're sharing, the note taker, the person who's receiving, is working and practicing to identify what emotion is being shared, or emotions, recalling a time that they themselves felt that emotion, and then write down and consider what they might need, and share their notes back with that partner after about a 10-minute discussion, and see if that emotion had been identified correctly, and if that gut reaction felt like it resonated. And when you're done, you can have a group discussion, and this can start to identify areas within yourself where you may need a little bit more practice. Another way to engage is by creating challenges. So there's a website that I think does a great job of this, specifically for type 1 diabetes, which it's instantempathy.com, and it's specifically designed right now for type 1 diabetes. So how can you create a greater empathic connection to either those that are caretakers of this disease state or have the disease state themselves? I think it's a set of about 52 cards. And the idea is that you would pull one of these cards, and whatever it says, you have to do it in that moment. So you might be sitting at your desk, you might be sitting in a meeting, you might be at a conference, and if you pull this card, and it sets up a scenario of, okay, you're the only one at the senior prom with a pump under your dress. In order to experience what that might be like, even in a small way, tape your cell phone to your side for the next 3 hours. And then think about, how did that make you feel? So that's a bit of that perspective taking, stepping into the shoes of another, actually putting yourself in context of an experience. So you can think about what are the experiences within your brand, your company, your situation for the problem you're trying to solve. What are experiences that your team can create, can try in order to feel some of those same emotional needs that your user might have? Starting to tie things up into just best practices. So for advanced design thinking, as you get more and more practice with this, you need to always start with the user. You need to begin with that deep level understanding. If you're starting to solve a problem and you're not sure what the emotional needs are of your users, you need to step back. You also need to be willing to take bold risks and build things early. Make things, make them physical, draw them out, make prototypes, get feedback. And this should be iterative and fast. Always be thinking about what's the cheapest way I can test my hypothesis, and then go ask people for feedback on that. And of course, collaborating. This isn't a team of one that is most successful. This is multiple perspectives. That the way you interpret someone else's emotions might be slightly different than another's. And so this is important to do in pairs, in groups of 3, and then also to test across each other and to determine, is this an insight everyone felt? So my request of you as you look to leverage empathy within your organization is to stop and see the need, to feel the emotion of your user, and to be bold and willing to reach out, to hold hands, to act on the behalf of that person that you've created a connection with. So with that, just want to launch one final poll, and this is just us doing good kind of housekeeping on whether or not this was effective, and if this would be something that you are likely to want to share with another person. So if you would, answer that poll. And we have left some time. I'll just quickly share some thoughts about where I work at Kaleidoscope and the kind of things we do, and then we'll take some questions. Okay, I think most people have had a chance to vote, so I'm going to go ahead and close it. So a little bit about where I work at Kaleidoscope. We've been around for 25, going on 26 years, headquarters in Cincinnati, about 90 employees, and we help the world's top healthcare, high-tech, and consumer good companies grow through product creation and experiences, marketing innovations. We do this through something called purpose-driven innovation. And this is the last slide, kind of plugging Kaleidoscope. And we do this through a myriad of ways, but the things that are most critical is that it's human-centered, that people are put at the center of everything that we do, that we step back to understand their needs, that we work in a multidisciplinary role. So around here I'm surrounded by people who are user experience experts, doctors and physicians, engineers, and together they combine in order to solve really big world problems. And it's actionable based on research. There's an infectious enthusiasm within our clients and around the office. We end up creating partnerships that last, more than 10 years often with our clients. And we work at this intersection of consumer, emerging tech, and healthcare. So we have lots of projects going on within each space, and we're leveraging the techniques and tools and thought processes across those in order to create the best experience. We have certified project management staff, which means projects go seamlessly. And also we have a quality management system that allows us to work seamlessly, especially within the medical space, with ISO 9001 and 13485 certification. Okay, so that's enough of that. And as you go to reflect and process this information, write these things down. We're not going to have you take the time to do this right now, but it's important to embed learning, that you have a personal reflection and a time to consider what information came your way, and what might it mean. So I'm asking you to think about what are 3 things that stood out to you, what are 2 questions this evoked, and what's 1 thing you will do to act on this information. And a couple suggestions there might be towards acting to research or better understand user needs, might be related to evaluation of prototypes, it could be about deciding on key product benefits. There's lots of different ways in. All right, so with that, I'm going to go ahead and open it up if there are questions. I'm not sure how to find those right now, but I believe you have a chance to click over on the right-hand side for the orange arrow and open up a questions box. All right, I'm trying to access that right now. All right, so there were a couple of questions just along the way about like getting a copy of this presentation, and yes, we're gonna publish it. We may just take out a few slides that contain some proprietary information. Okay, and I just saw a question from Josh Davis about involving children in your ideation sessions. I absolutely love this idea. And another way of thinking about it too is just who can bring a fresh perspective and be willing to break down barriers. So as you're moving into that ideation phase and you have some idea of what do you want to solve for, what are the problems, who can you get as part of the session to bring a fresh perspective? And I think children can absolutely be used. The way that it's been done most often is more as like a separate session. It's a little bit harder to involve them with the full team, but it can be done, especially if you're talking more like middle school to high school. And also, I always suggest invite your interns. So go around the office and find the people who have somewhat nothing to lose. You know, they're there for a short period of time. They're going to be willing to voice their opinion, and it's likely to be a very fresh perspective. Okay, so there's another question here too about. What's this? I just clicked off of it. About high energy. So can empathy have a ceiling effect? And what do you recommend to make sure that you're integrating clients' feelings but still act independently in your innovation? So the way that I'm interpreting this is a bit of, you know, what if you get into a really high emotional state? What can occur? How do you interact then with the clients? So something that is very real is as you go into this kind of work, there may be tears, and people may feel transformed and feel that it's hard to just go back to the way things were. That if you've gone through a week-long process where you're engaging with individuals one-on-one to understand their needs and how your product can potentially solve those needs, often it does change things. And so we will spend a lot of time on the front end preparing people for that possibility of, you know, that what you're about to hear may change the way you approach things and may be very impactful. And we spend a lot more time in the debrief phase accordingly. So following interviews, often there's like a 1-hour debrief to hit the top level. Hey, here are the 10 insights. Everyone agree? Great, let's go. That's what we're working on. And I would suggest nothing short of an entire day. So one way of thinking about this is 1 hour of debrief for every hour that you spent with consumers. So if you talked to 3 consumers, each for about 3 hours, you're talking about trying to spend 9 hours to process that emotional information, and that can often be required. And just looking for some final questions here. Tips for convincing clients without experience in design thinking of how to invest the time and money in empathic research versus jumping straight to the concept prototype phase. Yeah, a lot of clients approach us with the, hey, we have this widget and now we need to make money with it, or hey, we know this is true, now what are the ideas? And it is often difficult to people are always open to the idea of you wanting to go and collect user insights and empathic connection. What they're not always convinced of is that it's worth money. So some of the convincing honestly occurs in things like this webinar, and finding those business examples that you can show people and say, hey, listen, if we go down this path of traditional innovation, we may be missing big opportunities. And I find that it's very compelling, specifically as you get to think about what's the competitive advantage. That if you're listening to what people tell you and you're taking that as your insight, well, that's what the competitors are doing as well. So if you want to go and get some competitive advantage in the marketplace, you need to start in a very different place, and you have to be willing to dig incredibly deep. And what's the most time spent and least time spent on the empathy phase for projects you've worked on, from Todd Stewart? So that's a great question as well. Most time, we have spent about 9 months doing global research. It did include in each of the global areas, include some light touch points towards innovation, but it wasn't until the 9 months were complete where we got back together and said, all right, where did things align from an emotional perspective? Where are things globally relevant versus relevant purely to just to one location? And so that was probably the longest, was 9 months. And the least amount of time can be half a day. So we have certainly gone through projects that felt like, all right, yes, we need to understand this consumer from a deeper level, but what we think we're going to find is not so emotionally deep that we need to spend a week doing it. So it can also have an impact within half a day. When that occurs, I also set pre-work requirements and post-work requirements that are a bit more of that perspective taking. So how do you get that entire client team that's about to go to that half day to have created some sort of personal experience and connection point to the potential emotional areas first. And I think that's probably the majority of the questions, and I'm probably just about right out of time. So again, just want to say thank you guys very much for dialing in. We will send out a version of these slides, and potentially I hit the record button, so we'll see what that recording looks like at the end, and if it's a quality recording to send out as well. So again, please continue to follow up. I've got some information up on the screen, and reach out to connect on LinkedIn, and I look forward to talking with you again soon. Thank you very much.